one of our own Tufts faculty, Dr. Udita Sanga. She's an assistant professor at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. As you can see, she's not here. She will be joining us remotely today. She has a very interdisciplinary background and research. She has a PhD in environmental science and policy and community sustainability from Michigan State University. She has an MS in ecology from Utah State University and a BE in biotechnology from Birla Institute of Technology in India. Her research bridges science and policy to address global food challenges by investigating the complex dynamics of social-ecological systems and their interplay with beliefs, and motivations, and decisions made by the people who shape those systems. Before coming to Tufts, she worked at several prestigious international organizations like the AgriSat, the CEMET, and the Stockholm Resilience Center. And her current research lays at the intersection of indigenous food systems, system science, and anthropology, and aims to bridge knowledge gaps for sustainable food futures, which is what she will be talking about today. So please help me welcome Dr. Sanga.
I can start now. So thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. And I apologize that I could not be there in person with you, but I'm really glad that we can make it work with a hybrid format. And so for today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on Indigenous insights into ecological stewardship and sustainability, and especially how it pertains to food systems transformations and futures. And to begin with, often in food systems research, we start by asking the question, how can we produce enough food to feed the world? But in indigenous food systems, the question changes slightly. The question becomes, how can we listen to the land? And this shift in perspective kind of, creates a space to think and rethink about how we think about food as more than a commodity or a transaction, but more as a reciprocal conversation with nature. So with that, you have an introduction of my background, but I'd like to introduce myself. I position myself as an interdisciplinary systems scientist who has been trained through the different, from in biotechnology engineering to ecology to sustainability and system science and environmental science and policy. And this interdisciplinary training allows me to explore issues such as climate adaptation, especially in the global south, food security, climate smart agriculture, groundwater governance, poverty traps, social ecological resilience, and more recently, and the focus of my talk today, on indigenous foodways. And I do this through various methods combining both quantitative surveys, but also qualitative interviews. And I bridge these two, these perspectives through system science methods, which include mental models, system dynamics models, and as well as agent-based model. But I'd also like to talk a little bit about, where I come from. And this is often not something that I talk about in professional spheres. But I was born and I grew up in the eastern state of Jharkhand in India, as you can see highlighted in red over there. And this is a state which, which was created in 2000 as a result of decades of struggle of indigenous people for self-assertion. And there are 32 recognized tribes within Jharkhand, with eight major tribes, including Santhal, Munda, Oraon, and Ho. And I belong also to the Munda tribe. And each of these tribes have their own distinct languages and customs, a lot of them arising from the Austroasiatic language family. As you can see in the map on the right, The state also is heavily forested, and it's a beautiful state with a lot of rolling hills, and contains a lot of India's minerals and coal. Most of the people are rural with agrarian lifestyle, with agriculture and forest-based livelihoods, and the culture is very steeply embedded in strong oral tradition, indigenous tradition, rich folklore, and cultural diversity. And I grew up in the state of in the city of Ranchi, as a second generation with urban city upbringing. And with that, I'd like to show you a photograph which holds a lot of meaning to me. This photograph was, as you can see, contains a few items, some flowers in pink that you see, some grains, some dried petals, and some green dried leaves. And this photograph, I took it when I was in Ranchi in 2020, which was in the middle of the pandemic, as the world had come to a stop. And a lot of people, I was living in India back then, and a lot of people had returned back to their homes where they grew up. Now, as a context, a lot of younger people in Ranchi move away to urban cities in search of jobs. And so this was also a big movement back home where we could reconnect to our culture, our identity. And so in one of those days, I was walking by the market, the local market, and there was a woman who was sitting by the side of the road and selling this. And I saw it and I realized that I did not recognize any of it. I did not recognize what this food was. And I talked to her, and she told me about the beautiful pink flowers that you see. And she told me about, the flower and how you could cook it and what the recipe was. And I went back home and I cooked it the way she explained it to me, and it was delicious. And I asked my father what that was, and he started telling me these stories of indigenous food that he grew up eating, but we did not grow up eating. And so with conversations with other indigenous scholars who like me also study food systems, we all realize that even though we know a lot about food in different contexts, we ourselves don't know a lot about the indigenous food systems where we belong. And so that kind of like seeded the idea or the desire to explore where our food comes from, what is indigenous, or I'll term it Adivasi, which means indigenous in Hindi. What does Adivasi food systems is, and explore a little bit about this loss of indigenous knowledge that occurs intergenerationally. And so, with this inspiration in mind, when I joined Tufts in 2023, I started to think about more deeply about these issues and wanting to go back and explore that. In February 2023, I went back and I did a small pilot study where I interviewed about 5 people from indigenous communities, mainly Munda and Urao, where I asked them stories about food and the different kinds of food, and that I got a lot of, deep and deep information already from those 5 interviews, which then I was able to apply for the Springboard application of Springboard grant, which was granted last year. And the grant focused on harnessing indigenous knowledge for food transformations with that case study of Adivasi food systems in Jharkhand, India, with my co-PI, Sarah Pinto and Ellen Messer. And the objective of this project was to understand the co-evolution of Adivasi food systems with the context of the political, economic, and ecological changes that happened in the region in the past 3 decades. We wanted to explore research questions like what are Adivasi food systems, how have they evolved over time, how do Adivasi practices, both in the past as well as in the present, reflect our cultural identity, food security, and adaptation strategies in response to changes. We also wanted to understand how can we bring this information and these insights of Adivasi foodways and perspectives to contribute to a constructive discourse surrounding food transformations. And so the work with the and this work was done in 2 phases. In phase 2, we're still it's still in progress. But for this presentation, I'm going to be focusing a lot on the insights that we gained from phase 1, which was through the pilot study, which sort of guides how we're doing data collection even now. And so I'm a big proponent of storytelling. So the structure of the rest of the presentation today is going to be in the form of a story. As you can see, this is sort of like how a story arc is, with the introduction, the build-up, the problem, the resolution, and ending. I'll start with giving a context of what Indigenous or Adivasi foodways are, and also then start to talk about like the evolution of Adivasi foodways and the different kinds of social-ecological changes that have happened over time that have led to the evolution of these foodways. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the loss of intergenerational knowledge, which then through our research, which we're trying to bring back and kind of like capture, so that we can talk about some insights that these Indigenous stories and perspectives can bring into the conceptualization of food, where we can talk a little bit more about food as as a conversation with nature, food as culture, food as self-medication, food also as sustenance, food as identity. So with all of that, I also bring in my positionality as a systems thinker and a systems modeler. And I make connections between Indigenous perspectives on food with how systems science thinks about food and food transformations, and what can we learn from that to move towards a more sustainable food future. So with that, foodways refer to the definition refers to the cultural, social, or the economic practices related to the production, preparation, or consumption of food within a specific community or a society. And this includes things like traditions or rituals. So for example, how food is prepared, shared, and its role in celebration or in daily life. It also includes the cultural and economic systems that shape how food is grown, how it's sourced, traded, or distributed. It also includes cultural identity and heritage. So, for example, how food is reflected in history, in stories, how food changes due to migration and through regional influences. It reflects, the social and political influences around food. So, for example, the impact of policies, globalization, which shape how food is accessed and how food is distributed. So, given this broad, perspective on food, I'd like to talk a little bit about Adivasi foodways. And Adivasi foodways are one of the main. What we found was one of the main characteristics of Adivasi foodways is how it's cyclical and seasonal. So I'll start with, the picture that I showed you in the beginning. And this picture is going to be interspersed throughout my presentation. But as you can see, I was mentioning about those pink flowers, and these flowers are handpicked, and it's called jirhul flowers. It's usually harvested during blooming season in February and March. It's very rich in nutrients and has medicinal properties, which people told me it can cure diabetes or urinary issues. It can also be anti-asthmatic. And, people often use it sauteed, mixed with some potatoes, some sweet water shrimp, cooked in a little bit of mustard oil and a little bit of salt. When you cook this flour, you boil this first and then saute that, and it's delicious. So spring is with jirhol flowers. When summer comes, people often collect flowers of the mahua plant. The mahua tree is a keystone species in this region, and often it flowers from March to May. People don't pluck the flowers directly from the tree. The flowers drop naturally and are gathered by hand. It's very sweet. So, and often it's fermented to produce the mahua liquor, which is a traditional alcoholic drink popular among tribal communities, but also has medicinal properties such as cough, bronchitis, skin diseases, and digestive issues. And so the dried mahua is what you see in the picture on the left. People also, since it's so sweet, and there's anecdotal songs and anecdotes and stories about how during summer the whole forest smells of the mahua plant. It's often can be eaten fresh or dried, and can also be used for making sweets, jams, or porridges. When monsoon rolls in and the rain comes, a lot of the region also, a lot of mushrooms start erupting from the ground. And one of the specific mushrooms that are very popular there is a small mushroom called rugra. It's a local delicacy. And these days it's harder to find, and it's very expensive because it's it's foraged through hands, but it's often found underground near termite mounds and just soon after the fresh monsoons, and it's available between like June to September. And it has a very short seasonal availability, which probably is also why it's so popular and so delicious. It's slightly meaty and slightly chewy in texture, with an earthy, nutty, and umami-rich flavor. Often, and it's very rich in protein, fiber, antioxidants, and essential minerals. People often, collect it from the ground, clean it, and it's used in curries or stir fries or pickles, with a little bit of mustard, garlic, onions, and traditional spices. When the winter comes, that's the dry season in the region. So that's when people dry the leafy greens. And as you can see, here's a list of all the different kinds of greens that are available in the region. What people do is dry these leaves, and as you can see in the picture, these dried leaves are mixed, and we prepare something called a marchor, which is a kind of a soupy broth mixed with rice and mixed with these delicious leaves, which carries people through to the winter, and then the spring comes again, and so the cycle goes on and on. So that brings me to, given how a lot of this information or this knowledge about the different kinds of flowers or different herbs or different food is often orally transmitted in these communities, and changes around in the environment due to migration, but also kind of, displacement or also separation of indigenous food systems with urbanization has led to the loss of this indigenous knowledge on Adivasi foodways. What it creates is also, but beyond the loss of the knowledge, it also creates a loss in cultural identity, because this food is a key part of the cultural identity, and changing it or losing it means also losing the stories or rituals or practices around it. It's also a loss in nutrition, because these traditional diets, as I've demonstrated, are often quite nutrient dense. And current transitions are leading to higher rates of malnutrition and lifestyle diseases, especially among the urban population. But also cases of malnutrition around in the rural areas, where it's getting harder and harder to access some of this traditional food. This also leads to a loss in food sovereignty. So a reliance on markets and government programs on public food distribution also undermines the self-sustaining food practices that have been around in Adivasi communities over centuries. So through the interviews that we did, we started to find patterns on how have Adivasi foodways evolved over time, and what has shaped this evolution, or sometimes the loss of the Adivasi foodways too. We also did some literature review on these patterns, and we found certain themes that emerged. So there were 5 key factors that emerged as dominant in creating these changes. Among them was predominant was migration, which exists in this region, both seasonally and long-term migration, especially for education or labor, where it becomes harder for traditional food practices such as foraging or millet-based diets to be replaced by more accessible urban staples like rice and wheat and processed food. And this migration also leads to a disconnect between, the intergenerational food knowledge with the younger generation who who, like me, settle in cities and towns. Then urbanization also leads to a shrinking in forest areas, in rural areas. It reduces access to forest foods. It also, the reliance on convenience and market-based foods replaces these foraged and homegrown ingredients, combined with, the movement towards like street food or packaged snacks or fast food influences dietary habits, especially among the youth. Displacement also emerged as one of the key aspects of the loss in foodways, especially due to displacement due to mining or dams or industrial projects that uproots Adivasi communities from their forests and cutting them off of traditional food systems. Climate change is a big factor as well, where there's more incidences of irregular or declining rainfall with extreme weather patterns, which changes traditional farming cycles as well as reduces agricultural productivity. Then a big aspect was also the introduction of hybrid seeds as well as like modern agricultural technology in the region in the 1990s, and the introduction of these hybrid seeds also introduced chemical fertilizers, which shifted the cropping patterns from traditional organic farming towards more intensive methods, and also a displacement of some traditional crops such as millets and pulses and traditional rice varieties to be replaced by market-driven crops. There's evidence that some of the modern agricultural technologies improved yield, but it also led to a reduction in crop and dietary diversity. So here I'd like to then pause again and talk a little bit more about the stories that people told me, because that's a big part of like what we were hearing. And these stories of how people think about food. Some of the questions that we asked people were, what do you think about food? We asked them to talk about their memories of food. We interviewed both elder people in the community, but also some younger people who are now transitioning towards more sustainable food and production, food consumption, and kind of revival of indigenous foodways. And this is a quote from some of the participants, where you can see how the visualization or conceptualization of food is slightly different, where they talk about the seasonality and the cyclical nature of food consumption, but they also talk about the communication with nature, or the perspective of looking at food as a conversation with nature, which is both reciprocal and kind of embedded within the relationship with nature. People also talked about how this conversation is in the form of observation of nature, whereas when it's the dry season, you see the roots and you realize that it's ready for herbs and for harvesting. Rather, so it's a different perspective of nature giving food as opposed to cultivating to get food. People also talked about their perspectives of their view of food as an integral part of culture. And here is where people talked about their own traditional food and how the different food has a story and has rituals that are attached to the food. They talked about why we eat what we eat. And through this relationship with these stories, it becomes more and more embedded in culture and is transmitted from generation to generation. People also talked about food as medicine, and they talked about the need for, people foraging and kind of experimenting with which foods led to, relief with certain maladies, because in these areas, hospitals used to be very far away. So people would rely on self-medication. And through that, they were able to, see that and observe that, for example, in this quotation here, you can see how the mahua plant or the mahua flower that I showed you earlier in the earlier slides can help in increasing blood count, or can help in addressing malnutrition. So there was a big list of the different kinds of food that people mentioned that people use as medication. And one of the plans in phase 2, when we go back into the field, is also to start building a repository of which herbs and plants lead to which kind of medication. And finally, I'm not going to go details of these, but there were several other conceptualizations of food. People talked about food as sustenance and food as identity. And food as identity emerged as a big aspect, especially among younger people, who talked about, again, this sort of loss in intergenerational knowledge, and who, like me, in 2020 moved back to the cities and started to understand and realize that as the world moves towards sustainability, Adivasi systems were always sustainable. So it's this looking back as well as looking at the future and rooting that within indigenous identity. People shared stories and symbols of food. For example, one of the stories that was shared with me was about harvesting or capturing crabs, especially from the farmlands. And people mentioned how when you're catching crabs, you would only capture male crabs and not the female crabs, because you'd want to have the female crabs reproduce more. So it's this kind of reciprocal kind of harvesting processes as well. And again, people also talked about sustainability. People definitely talked a lot about the feedbacks and systems, and how the introduction of chemical fertilizers are disrupting the land and decreasing the soil health and soil quality, and that the connections of that with riverways and availability of fish. So people were very highly aware of the interlinks between the different aspects of modern agriculture and how it can lead to unsustainable ways of production. So given all the complexity and depth of what even just these few 5 interviews provided us, I've been trying to, place that and make sense of both my identity as a systems scientist, but also as an indigenous scholar who's looking at foodways and learning more about it and the way I want to think about it. And this is a diagram from the traditional ecological knowledge lab from Oregon State University. And they talk about the two-eyed seeing. So it's not a matter of Western science versus indigenous science. They talk about, the two-eyed seeing, so kind of blending and braiding indigenous knowledge with Western science to reimagine a climate resilient future. So people talk about these mutual ways in which how we can see and observe and make sense of that. So with this as an inspiration, I would like to offer some insights into how I was trained with systems thinking, and the links between how we see indigenous knowledge and what indigenous knowledge is, and the links of that with complex adaptive systems and system science. So I'll start with the indigenous knowledge. There are a few characteristics of indigenous knowledge, which by definition is a cumulative body of knowledge, practices, and beliefs, which evolve by adaptive processes and handed down through generations through cultural transmission, right? So, and some of the key characteristics of this indigenous knowledge is that it's place-based. So it's very embedded within the social context. It's also temporal, because a lot of this information and knowledge has been created over centuries of observation spanning millennia, and through experimentation of what is food and what is medication. It's also a factor of like a collective mental model of people, where all this information is cognitively within the collective memory of Indigenous people. One of the other characteristics of Indigenous knowledge is also it's kinship based. So, for example, it's as you saw, and how people were talking about food as conversation with nature, where nature is not something to be extracted, but more of like a reciprocal give and take between the two. It's also embedded very deeply within the culture, and it's also a factor of like adaptive learning through time, where all of these changes also changes some of the food ways. And also it's holistic. And the word holistic was very interesting to me because holistic is a term that we use very much in systems science. We talk about interrelationships. And so with complex adaptive systems, which are defined as dynamic systems, which evolve over time by responding to feedback and changes in the environment, we talk about how complex adaptive systems have a memory and have the ability to transform and exhibit dynamic resilience, and where past experiences shape future behavior. And I found a lot of similarities between, how Indigenous knowledge sees food and food transformations with how complex adaptive system also talks about it. So some of the characteristics, again, as similar to Indigenous knowledge systems, is how it is contextual and place based and dependent on the observer and who's doing the context making. It's also open and has porous boundaries. It's complex adaptive systems also talks about relational, especially relationship between the social and the ecological. It's also dynamic, where some of the dynamics are faster and some are slower and non-linear. A big part of complex adaptive systems is also how it's adaptive and self-organizes, where the sum is where the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So given all these links between these two different perspectives, I'd like to offer some insights into how this can be, seen, how this can contribute. This can be contributed to how we think about food systems transformations. And I'll begin with the CAS, or the complex adaptive system perspective, where the focus is a lot on improving or enhancing resilience, so that food systems can withstand climate and non-climate shocks and remain flexible, and have a chance for recovery. The focus is also on improving adaptive learning, where we improve our mental models, and it's continually updated. It improves decision making as well as efficiency, reducing redundancy, but also facilitating some systemic change. And this is important because this means recognizing the interconnectedness among the different components of a food system, while it enables coordinated or sustainable transformation, where we really focus on the trade-offs that emerge when we're moving towards a different kind of or more sustainable food systems transition. Again, it also focuses a lot on the role of innovation, especially inclusive and responsible innovation, can have in supporting alternative food networks or alternative food transitions. But I think to add to that, which is the other eye within the view of the two-eyed seeing framework that I showed you, is also how Indigenous knowledge systems can focus a lot on how we're thinking about the values and beliefs and culture and agency, especially about the shift in our collective mindset or our cognitive maps along with the structures and practices. So shift in perspective of how we view our relationship with food, and which kind of guides how we then produce it, how do we consume it, and how do we process it. The other thing that it focuses on is making it more inclusive. So, for example, to contribute to a plural understanding of the assessment of food transformations. We can learn a lot from these indigenous food systems because they've been practicing it for centuries. But unfortunately, even complex adaptive systems or system science so far have not acknowledged its origins with indigenous knowledge systems on adaptive learning. So there is a bit of epistemological injustice in this. So it's important to bring that inclusivity into the table and support diversity. So the more diversity we have in perspectives and diversified farming systems, but also food habits, the better or the more resilient our food futures would be. The other thing is about facilitating cultural practice lens, which recognizes human agency in being a big motivator for social change. Based on my interviews with younger people, there seemed to be a big drive. So a lot of people talked a little also about, like being shamed for their indigenous food habits when they were growing up. And now they talked about making indigenous food systems cool. So bringing in, like starting young entrepreneurs are bringing in and reviving some of these traditional food, recognizing that this now is being sustainable. It can create a social change, so with that, there's also collective learning where there's nurturing of intergenerational well-being and promoting a kind of collective engagement with the community. And a big part of our project in the second phase is going to be about collecting these stories, what we learned from the elders, and recording that and preserving that in the form of illustrated storybooks, which highlight some of these food practices, but also recipes and their benefits going in the future. So we're closer to the time, and so I'll leave you with the last slide, which talks about the merging of these two different perspectives, the complex adaptive systems as well as indigenous knowledge systems, which I'm trying to do, where there is a more symmetric dialogue versus an asymmetric integration of indigenous knowledge that forefronts ecological stewardship and sustainability as we collectively think about food systems transformations. And with that, I would open up to discussions and questions. But before we go into the discussion and questions, some of my colleagues at Friedman School have asked me to share some information about, if you're interested in food or anything related to food, agriculture, environment, climate, and sustainability, we're offering an accelerated Master of Science degree where you can learn about that. Friedman is a great space where there's a space enough for people with diverse perspectives and professors who are working on that. And so if you want to know more about this accelerated Master of Science program, there's a webinar that's going to happen today at 4 to 5 p.m. So you can register there.